Good evening. Greg Williford here, your co-facilitator. And with me, of course, is Father Fred Hurd. Say hello, Fred. Technical Director, Ms. Lori Murphy-Cole. Hello, Lori. Thank you for all your help in helping Taylor get set up. Welcome to the third Thursday conversation in our series for autumn. We have our guest speaker, Mr. Taylor Marrow III, and we are excited to have his presentation. I think you'll find it very informative and interesting. He's going to talk to us about some very key core issues relative to racism today and with a slice of history connected to it. So welcome, everyone. Just as we get started, remember, we have the ground rules. So as we begin our discussion, keep those in mind. And I think without further ado, I'd like to get Taylor on because I'm excited to hear what he has to say.
Let me plug in first because Taylor, you know how Murphy is. So let me say to everybody, we discovered, thanks to one of our participants, that those of you that use phone or a tablet may not be able to see the full gallery view all the time. And it may be difficult for you to send an actual chat when you want to ask a question. So the group is small enough. If you want to say anything, either raise your hand or unmute yourself and say, hey, I want to say something. Okay, we'll just do it like that because we want everybody included. So Taylor, we're going to toss it over to you, young man. Go for it. Unmute yourself.
Excellent. Thank you all. Good evening. And thank you so much for inviting me to come talk with you about the civil rights movement, kind of some of the strategies of the movement, and then how we can, potentially apply some of those strategies in the modern era. So my name is Taylor Andre Marrow III. I am named after my grandpa that is back there, Taylor Andre Marrow Sr. My father's name is Taylor Andre Marrow Jr. So growing up, my nickname was Todd because there's so many Taylors in my family. So that's kind of the name people call me, is Todd. I got my start in education really from, just growing up. My mom was a voracious reader. My father and my grandfather both read. My grandfather and my grandmother used to work at Princeton University. My grandfather worked in housing, and my grandmother worked at the museum at Princeton University. And she actually was friends with Albert Einstein and went to Albert Einstein's house and had dinner at Albert Einstein's house. He would come and visit her as she was a security guard at the museum. I grew up, in my 18 years growing up, I grew up in Princeton, New Jersey, in the Witherspoon-Jackson community, in a house that my grandfather built with my uncle, that my dad lived in, that I lived in. My mom and dad still live there. So it was really great to have, cousins just down the block and people living with me, having, a family that really cared for me, and then also having access, particularly growing up in Princeton, having access to high quality education. The high school that I graduated from was number one in the public high school in the state when I graduated in 1990. It was top 5 in the nation. So, Princeton High School has a very great reputation, and it really provided me with a good background into to being successful in college and to being a successful teacher. And then growing up in Princeton really paved the way for me to be a successful historian. I mean, I grew up going to the park and playing in the park where the Battle of Princeton, one of the most pivotal battles of the Revolutionary War, was fought. That was in my backyard. With my Boy Scout troop, we used to go camping at Washington's Crossing State Park, where George Washington crossed the Delaware. And we'd go camping there. We'd find musket balls still trouncing through the woods. So, my life was literally walking through the very foundation of this nation, because the town I grew up in, Princeton, was founded in 1689, and it was founded as Princetown, and they shortened it to Princeton, New Jersey. So that's kind of a little bit of my background. From Princeton, graduated from high school, took a couple years off, traveled around the country seeing Jerry Garcia and the Grateful Dead. Then I ended up at Indiana University in Bloomington, where I went to a Big Ten school, where I majored in history. And I worked full-time at a college bar, paying my way. I double majored in history and telecommunications, which now is called the School of Media Arts. So broadcasting was what I focused on, and production, TV production and music production. Then I took a year off, went to graduate school at Ball State University, where I earned a master's degree from Ball State, which is in Muncie, Indiana, about an hour and a half away from Bloomington. It was a great education in the Hoosier State. I really, the Hoosier State is dear to my heart, going there. And I had a really good opportunity to study race relations, study lynching, and then also become published at Ball State University. I got a great opportunity my senior year, my last year at Ball State, during the second year, where the program that I was working for, I was my graduate assistantship, my boss was like, hey, do you want to take on this project of writing a pamphlet for this organization called Teamwork for Quality Living, which is a grassroots organization in the town. And it was a history of race relations in Muncie. And it really was to orient new teachers coming into the Muncie school district and the K through 12 school district to the history of Muncie, so that they could understand how complex the history of Muncie was, and still how complex the history of Muncie is. So again, that's a little bit of who I am. Does anybody have any questions about where I grew up, or my family background? Excellent. So I guess the one other thing I would say is that, also in growing up in Princeton, I've always had really great role models in my life. First starting with my mom and my dad, who really instilled a big work ethic in me. Then I would say, for extending from there, it would be, my friends and their parents, that all had a huge impact, because, I grew up in the 70s where, everyone that was an adult in the block that knew my parents well had the right to discipline me, right? So it really kind of was a community, a collective disciplining through several blocks and neighbors. And then really through the other big thing in my life, which was Boy Scouts. I spent from my fourth grade year up through high school. Even though I didn't get my Eagle Scout, that's one of the most disappointing things, is all I had to do was do my community service project. That probably had the biggest impact in my life. The crew of boys that I was hanging out in, the life skills that I got, and then really the opportunity to travel around the country. So if there's no questions, I'm going to get started. And what I really want to talk about tonight, as I said, is kind of give you a history of the civil rights movement, and how complex it is. And I think why I want to take this approach is, one, it's something I know very well. Two, when I learned the complexities of the civil rights movement, it really was an aha moment on about how you organize and what sort of discipline it takes. John Lewis, when talking about working with Dr. King and talking about the philosophy of the civil rights movement of satyagraha, which was a term, a Hindu term from Gandhi, which means truth and firmness, right? And that really is the basis of nonviolent direct action, truth and firmness, that if you stay true to your ideals of nonviolence and you are firm and committed to nonviolence, right, the truth will be there and bear witness for the rest of the world to see. And John Lewis talks about the discipline that it took in the movement to be nonviolent. And I would argue that there's not just that discipline to be nonviolent, but there also is the discipline in organizing and connecting groups and creating a structure and leadership. So if there are any questions, I'm going to share my screen and then start talking about the civil rights movement. So, excuse me. When thinking about the civil rights movement, what I talk to my students about and what Black historians and historians of the civil rights movement talk about are the 4 stages of the civil rights movement. And we're going to talk about 3 of them today and briefly touch on this 4th one we're living in, which is political action. So the first phase of the civil rights movement is this strategy called legalism. There are also historians that call it constitutional liberalism. but African Americanists call it legalism. And that is from 1930s to 1954, although the timeline keeps being pushed back in the movement, where the start and the genesis is using the courts to overturn the legal justification for segregation, discrimination, and disenfranchisement, right? So this is what this first process is about. How can, through a system of law and court, can the justification for separation, disenfranchisement, and discrimination against African Americans be turned over? The second phase is nonviolent direct action. This is the phase that most people are familiar with, right? Dr. King, mass protest movement, bus boycotts, sit-ins. That's from 54 to 65. And then in 65, there starts to be this significant change as laws are passed and legalism is won, and the Civil Rights Act occurs, and so does the Voting Rights Act, with this shift towards militancy, right, and kicking out of whites out of the movement, the rise of Black Power. And then by the 1970s, we move to this process, I would say is best kind of demonstrated by, you know, John L. Lewis, Barack Obama, Jesse Jackson, people running for political office, or where we are at, which is called political action. So these are these broad stages, these four broad stages of the civil rights movement that historians talk about. Any comments or questions so far? All right, so the first stage that is set, right, and many of you might be familiar with this, right, the rise of Jim Crow. And so Jim Crow is a euphemism. It is a euphemism for the legal segregation of African Americans in society. And the court case that establishes this as law on the land is called Plessy versus Ferguson. And Plessy v. Ferguson occurs in 1896. And what Plessy v. Ferguson establishes is, you know, the legal standard, which is this policy of, as long as the facilities are equal, they can be separate, right? So this is the policy of the law of the land, right? That yes, we can have segregated facilities, we can have segregated schools, but they must be equal. And so throughout the land after 1896, you see the implementation legally of the separation of African Americans and Black people in this country from white people. And it's most prominent in the South, but it does occur in the North as well. And you see it reflected in schools, you see it reflected in movie theaters, swimming pools. You see it reflected in, you know, basically every facet of life, from the water fountain all the way to the swimming pool. And the reality of this separate but equal, it was always unequal, right? And it gets to the argument that the NAACP uses during its strategy of legalism is to attack this separate piece and to attack how that separate is inherently unequal. So are there any comments about this? Is everyone familiar, a little bit familiar with Plessy v. Ferguson? And if you're not, please do not hesitate to chime in with raising your hand or asking a question. So in order to overturn Plessy, the NAACP uses this strategy, and this strategy is legalism. So the way the law works is you've got to build up precedents, and this is what is, I guess, for me, the most disheartening part about the strategy of legalism is how long it takes, right? And that's just the nature of our legal system. Our legal system and jurisprudence is a very slow process, and it's a slow process so lawyers and judges can adjudicate in a fair manner, right? And that's what makes it difficult. It's a process of appeals from lower courts to higher courts to eventually the Supreme Court. And so this is the objective of the NAACP during legalism, to slowly chip away at Plessy Ferguson, to slowly chip away at this justification. And the way they do it is through this sub-organization within the NAACP called their Legal Defense Fund, and this is still in existence today. The Legal Defense Fund in 2020 is fighting many of the ID laws, voter restriction laws, the fight to get open more ballot and polling places in states is a big piece of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in the modern era. It's an organization that was founded by the first African-American Supreme Court Justice, Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall was educated at a historically Black college and university, and he led this organization. And his belief was that through Howard University and law students at Howard University that he helped to train, that what they could create were judges that would be able to, or sorry, not judges, lawyers that would be able to fight in the court on multiple fronts, right? Plessy versus Ferguson, to chip away and slowly build up precedent. And it is a very strategic and time consuming, but most importantly, well thought out plan, right? To develop a model to end what becomes, you know, the justification for separate but equal, which is Plessy v. Ferguson. This is a young, dapper Thurgood Marshall, the first African-American Supreme Court Justice. So again, they mount several challenges and they get really early successes. And one of the cool moments that I had was to see this connection of why nonviolent direct action, the second phase, is needed, right? These things are all linked because of the successes that happened under legalism. So in 1938, the NAACP and the Legal Defense Fund takes up the case of a man by the name of Lloyd Gaines. Lloyd Gaines was an African-American who tried to enter into the University of Missouri's law school that was segregated. There was no separate Black law school for students at the University of Missouri. So Lloyd Gaines decided to, along with the help of the NAACP, sue. The case reached the Supreme Court, and they ruled that the University of Missouri needed to admit Lloyd Gaines or provide a separate but equal facility. The University of Missouri opted for the separate facility, which was not equal. They ended up building facility for Lloyd Gaines, for African-American law students in an empty, abandoned bookstore that they converted into a place for these students. Interestingly enough, with this victory, in 1939, Lloyd Gaines ended up leaving an NAACP meeting in Chicago and never being heard from since. He disappeared. His family still has him listed as a missing person. No one really knows what happened to Lloyd Gaines, but he really is important in one of these early victories in the strategy of legalism. Another one of these important victories occurs in 46 in the case Morgan versus Virginia. And this really gets at a issue in the United States that addresses the Constitution on multiple fronts, right? So this gets at the Interstate Commerce Clause in the Constitution. And the Interstate Commerce Clause has been broadly interpreted throughout the years. It really becomes the justification, if you look at the very beginning and foundation of the country, for the development of the Federalist Party and our Federalist system, right? The reason why Washington and Hamilton believed and justified that the government should have a strong central government was to regulate commerce between the states. Because if the federal government does not regulate commerce, that means conflict. Conflict between the states probably wouldn't end up well, particularly with the European models of separate commerce. So what the NAACP does is they attempt to use this justification that interstate bus commerce should be regulated under the Interstate Commerce Clause, and that any segregation on buses from New Jersey all the way down to Georgia, where you have to segregate facilities, you have to then segregate Black people on the bus, you have to segregate them at the bus stops, you have to build separate counters, that this is an undue burden on interstate commerce. So it is a victory. But there's a problem. What do you think the problem is with not only that victory in Missouri v. Gaines, but also this victory in Morgan v. Virginia? Because after Morgan v. Virginia, if you were a Black person, legally, you should be able to ride a bus from New Jersey to Alabama and never what? Anybody? Yes, Lori.
Never have to sit in the back of the bus.
Excellent, right? Or never have to go to a segregated lunch counter.
Right.
Excellent. Yes.
You know, Taylor, I was thinking as you were talking there, I was in New Orleans in 1957 as a high school student. I was a junior in high school, and I was with several of my classmates. And we were on a bus touring New Orleans. And there was an old lady when we got on because the bus was full, who stood up to give me her seat. And I declined to take her seat. And somebody mumbled something, and then finally we didn't understand what they were saying, and finally motioned to a sign that was stuck on the back of the seat. And as the whites came on the bus, and there was less and less room on the bus, you were expected to move that sign back, which said whites only. And so if it got to the back, it meant that all of the blacks had to stand on the bus. And so that was one thing. And then I was on a train when we were going to Washington D.C. and I wanted a magazine, and somebody said, well, they're in the conductor's seat in the last car of the train. And so I just walked back to the last car in the train, and the conductor said, what are you doing back here? And I was in the colored car. And he said, I'll bring you the magazines. You get out of this car. You're not supposed to be in here. And so that was enforced. It was very strictly enforced, both with the metro system and then on the interstate trains.
Excellent. Thank you very much for sharing, Fred. Yeah, the reality is that part of it is, right, what I like to talk about with my students is the psychology of racism and white supremacy. That part of it is done through propaganda, right? It was done through, physical violence like lynching. And then part of it is done in that minutia, that very small level, like separate drinking fountain, when the water all goes to the same place, gets treated and comes from the same place, right? Things like separate counters or separate buses, like you have to move to the back of the bus, but then you can stand, right? So like standing next to a person of color is fine, but sitting next to them is not, right? And some of the interesting with this, helps to illuminate, for me at least, Fred, is again, these contradictions, right? So when I think about Southern society and Southern white society and segregation, you see all this minutia and the enforcements of all this really kind of weird codes, like you were saying. But when you are wealthy and elite and you wanted to get your hair cut as a white person, where did you go? You went to a black barber, right? Think how intimate that is, right? You don't want to drink after the same water fountain. They can't sit next to you, but it is something of privilege to be able to go to a black barber and have them shave you, right? Cut your hair. Think of the wealthy woman that had a black nanny or a black wet nurse, right? So, again, I would argue that a lot of these small idiosyncratic rules, right, that existed, like, get off the sidewalk if you're black, if you're white, you don't go into the black car, were really for poor white people, right? Because no matter where they were in their station in life, they still, even if they were poor, even if they might have been poorer than an African American in that car, train car, or on that bus, was still elevated over them in status. Good. Any comments or questions? Yes, Fred.
There was a restaurant at the train station in Oakland when I was a boy, and all of the employees were African American. And that always, even though I came from an area in Oregon where we had a goodly number of African Americans, that always was interesting to me that all of the employees were African Americans. So flash forward then to that trip that I was on through New Orleans and Washington, D.C. And one morning I got up and my friends slept late, and so I decided to go out for breakfast. And I just went in Washington. I walked into this restaurant, and all the employees were African American. I didn't think anything about it because I'd been in the restaurant in Oakland. And I sat down, ordered my breakfast, and they were very nice and welcoming. And then I looked around and I was the only white person in the restaurant. And so this is Washington in 1957. So it's not ancient history.
Yes, that's a thing that I think a lot of, particularly for my millennial and Gen Z students, it's hard for them to see the how the 60s is really close to them. You talk about the 60s, like my 14-year-old thinks the 60s was like 1900 or even like 1850s, right? They think it's this archaic period in American history.
Yeah.
The thing that was lacking in this case was enforcement. Right? Who enforces it, right? That's what you were talking about. There were people to enforce segregation, but who was to enforce blacks didn't have to be segregated. And so that's why the second phase was needed. So nonviolent direct action is needed because you need to go out and sit down at a lunch counter, right? You need to go out and show at a school that, that's not being desegregated, right? And that's why the second phase is needed. It's to provide that enforcement and the creation of a federal institution to enforce the rights for all Americans. And that eventually in 1964, with the Civil Rights Act, that becomes the Civil Rights Division within the Justice Department. But that's what is needed in this second phase. So I hope you can see that connection between, okay, so we've got these important court cases. We've been chipping away. We got, Brown v. the Board of Education. But what we don't have is this second phase. This is one of my most fascinating people that I love of the civil rights movement. She is known as Jane Crow. Her name is Pauli Murray. And she was one of these students that was educated at Howard University Law School. This place where it's a historically black college and university, and Thurgood Marshall viewed it as the incubator of lawyers that he could send out and fight for civil rights throughout the various appellate courts. She attempted to enter Harvard University, but was ejected because of her gender. She was a founding member of now the National Organization of Women. She was the first ordained female, I want to say, Episcopal minister. And what's important to her about the civil rights movement is when she was a student at Howard, she suggested in one of her lectures to not attack the unequal, but attack the separation part in Plessy v. Ferguson. It really shifted the NAACP's strategy. And in 1951, she published States Laws on Race and Color, and according to Thurgood Marshall, it became the civil rights Bible for civil rights lawyers. She's one of these unsung heroes that not people really know, but she was an activist the entirety of her life, and a woman of deep faith, but also a woman that was, in the modern era, she might have had more latitude to express her gender. She was an individual that she believed she had what we call now gender dysphoria, but oftentimes she perceived herself as a him. She engaged in relationships with other women as well. But she's one of these people, again, that was really important in that phase of legalism and shifting the paradigm for the NAACP and also for lawyers that were going and fighting for civil rights. Jane Crow, Pauli Murray. So 52, yes, question from, I know, so I can't see your name.
Sorry, I had a little problem with that. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Perfect.
Okay. I separate and equal, and you gave an example about how things being unequal.
Yes.
And then you said that this lawyer was that they call Jane Crow. She changed the focus to the separate part. What do you mean? What would be an example of what she would, because the separate part I thought was the whole idea.
Yes.
And so how did she?
Yeah, good point. Good question. So before, it was the NAACP trying to attack the unequal part. Instead, they came to this generalized argument that separation is inherently unequal. So they moved it to this
Got
idea
it.
that by it being separate itself creates what Thurgood Marshall called a badge of inferiority among African Americans. And one way they were able to do that and prove their case, an awesome question. What is your name again? I'm sorry.
Bobby.
Bobby, awesome question, Bobby, and thank you. One of the things that was important in winning Brown v. Board was this important psychological experiment in which they presented African-American boys and girls with dolls, two choices. It's called the doll experiment, where they gave the
Right.
white doll and the black doll. And overwhelmingly by 90+%, the young black people would take the white doll. And what that is a demonstration of is low self-esteem. And that was part of the train of argument about why separation was inherently flawed. Awesome.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Bobby. That's excellent, excellent question. And so then the Supreme Court announced this decision in desegregating, but this is the caveat. The caveat for the decision that Chief Justice Earl Warren, who was appointed by Dwight D. Eisenhower, said, he said, desegregation should occur with all deliberate speed, was how it was written. And so he wrote that intentionally vague. Why do you think that is?
Probably because who can define speed?
Excellent. So Eisenhower and Warren both were not segregationists. Eisenhower, he was a military man. He understood that the worst thing for the modern US military was to keep them segregated. You would not have unit cohesion. You would not have the greatest fighting machine in the world. So that's one of his big things. But he also understood if you push too hard, if you push too fast, fundamentally the problem would be a violent backlash and revolt. So they worked to allow schools to desegregate at a pace that they wanted. Eventually, they had to pick that pace up when they start to protect young students going into Arkansas and Little Rock High School. But initially, it's this really slow process that they envision. But the federal government actually comes in, intervenes, and works forcefully to desegregate public schools. Does anyone know what the response was for many southern states to federal government and enforcing of desegregation? You see the rapid increase of private schools in the South, and particularly private Christian schools that remain all white. And part this is done because, again, Brown only impacts public schools. Another way they do it is, so many public schools in the Deep South, Georgia, Louisiana, still in the modern era have segregated proms. How do they do it? Well, the proms are private events put on by parents organizations, not put on by the school. And that's how they're able to still keep segregation going in schools, but also still keep segregation going as well in events in public schools.
Taylor?
Yes.
Marge has a comment or a
Yes,
question.
sure.
Marge, go ahead.
Oh, hi. Thanks. In the 80s, from 1980 till about 1988, I worked in Alexandria, Virginia city schools. And in order to get the folks to send their kids back into the public school system, what they had done was created the track system. So you had the academic track and the general ed track, and you can guess who was in which. Right. But that brought the parents, that let the parents then brought their kids back into the public school system. Remember the Titans is a movie about the football team from that school, and you might recall that was a fairly monochrome group of people, but obviously they weren't in the academic track.
Yes, excellent. Yeah, and again, this is what southern states did because they wanted to maintain the status quo. And although a lot of significant changes happened, I used to live in North Carolina, I used to live in Georgia. There still is a lot of places in the South where they are able to maintain that segregation, whether it's done through private institutions that host proms or parties for graduation parties, or whether it's private institutions that are schools. Thank you very much for sharing, Marge. Excellent. Any other comments or questions? Yes, Fred. Excellent.
Unmute Fred.
There's a guy that I knew in the 8th grade, and we were in a Christmas play together. I mentioned this the other day, but I want to relate it to this. And he was one of the kings in the Christmas play, and I was the second king. And so we went to junior high together, and then eventually he went on to Southern Oregon University and was one of the first American blacks admitted there. He became an actor, and he played Gideon on Daniel Boone, for any of you that were Daniel Boone fans. And he also was Sheriff Ed Little in the TV series The Dukes of Hazzard, and a number of other roles. But and he just died just about 3 years ago. But his mom, I knew her, and she was the head of the NAACP in Klamath Falls, where I grew up. And she was a trained teacher. She had a college degree and everything, but she could not get a job teaching because she was African American. And this was in Klamath Falls, where we had African American students. Obviously, her son was one that I went to school with, but she herself could not get a job teaching because of her race. And so you know, it wasn't just the South. It was pervasive throughout the country. And you know, I had a newspaper route with Oregon Journal, and decided I wanted to take Sundays off. And so a friend of mine lived in my neighborhood, Delmer Young, and I wanted to bring him on as my substitute. And my boss said, well, I think that would be fine, but you've got to go around and ask each one of your customers if they would mind having a colored carrier deliver their newspaper. And so I had to go door to door and ask each one of my customers. And if one of them objected, we couldn't do it. And I'm kind of proud to say none of them objected and said that would be okay. So Delmer was my substitute for a couple of years. But it was everywhere. It really was.
Yes, that is a very good point. So my hometown, you were talking about that actor that you knew, is the hometown of Paul Robeson, one of the premier African-American thespians. But my hometown, the high school was the lower grades were segregated until you got into high school. So like my mom and dad went to segregated schools until they got to high school. And after high school, then the schools became integrated again, which I thought was strange, but that was how it was for much of the until I want to say until the 70s, until like probably like 1968, 1970. Thank you very much for sharing. So again, people worked around it, and they worked around it because there's those, you know, those holes in those gaps. But that's what the second phase was for. And the beginning of this second phase, which is called nonviolent direct action, or some historians call it direct action liberalism, was the Montgomery bus boycott. And most people are familiar with the Montgomery bus boycott because of Rosa Parks. And this was this moment where historians used to talk about it as a moment that was random, like this random happenstance chance that Rosa Parks says that she was tired and refused to give up her seat on the bus. That's not the case. Women had been refusing to give up their seats in segregated cars. Pauli Murray did before that in the 19th century in 1884. Ida B. Wells Barnett did in Tennessee. And even a year before, Claudette Coleman in Montgomery, a young African-American woman that was an out-of-wedlock African-American woman, refused to give up her seat on the bus, but the local organizations didn't think she was the perfect representative to build a movement around. But on December 1st, Parks did refuse to give up her seat and on that bus in Montgomery. That sparked this second phase of nonviolent direct action. But again, getting back to this thing that I hope will be a big, we could talk about in a little bit, which is how the movement was successful. What sort of training and strategies did they apply? Well, again, Rosa Parks was not happenstance. One, she was the secretary for the local NAACP in Montgomery. Her husband was the president. Two, she was also trained at this school called the Highlander Folk School. The Highlander Folk School is this school in Highlander, Tennessee, in the mountains of Tennessee. And its purpose is they train, it's a normal school, right? So they train people to become teachers, but they do it in social justice and civic activism. Rosa Parks took a summer session up at Highlander Folk School, summer session on nonviolent direct action, nonviolent protests, as many of the civil rights icons did and attended the school. The school still exists today, still doing the same work, right? Training teachers in civil rights and social justice, but also in this strategy that is continuous from Gandhi, Satyagraha, truth and firmness, extended through Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement. So that's an example of, again, the intentionality of this movement and how this second phase was not happenstance, but it really was about demonstrating here are the gaps that exist in society, and we can attack those gaps through protest and show the nation, and also attack the capitalist funds for these companies to force them and coerce them to change. And in addition to Rosa Parks, in addition to the Highlander Folk School and her training, there also was the very grassroots organizations of the Montgomery bus boycott, which is the MIA, or the Montgomery Improvement Association. This is an organization led by Edie Nixon, who is the head of the Montgomery NAACP, and Joanne Robinson, who was the leader of the Women's Political Council. So it's a coordinated coalition of the NAACP, of local churches, local church groups, local women's groups, that is coordinated under the umbrella of the Montgomery Improvement Association. So these organizations had already existed prior to the bus boycott, but they didn't have one singular focus, right? Some were focused on voting and registering people to vote, right? Some were focused on just community care, right, and activism, providing food, better schools. Some were just promoted, again, like churches, right, focusing on the spirituality. But they come together in a coordinated effort, and they organize, and they go to the Baptist church, the Ebenezer Baptist Church, where a young minister from Atlanta comes up because Edie Nixon saw him speak and throws him to the forefront of the movement, and he then becomes the eloquent speaker of the movement, Dr. Martin Luther King. So again, I hope that you can see that there's an intentionality. There's a coordination at the local grassroots level, through churches, the Black Church, through organizations like the Women's Political Council, the Black Freemasons, the Black Elks Clubs, things like the League of Women's Voters, the Negro League of Women's Voters, and all of these come under the umbrella of MIA and NAACP of the Montgomery Improvement Association to coordinate the boycott. So what do you think a boycott of buses takes, since the vast majority of those people in Montgomery using the bus were African American? What do you think?
They were walking a lot.
Excellent, right? Walking a lot. Excellent. What else? Carpooling. Busing, right? Coordinating busing. And so how the word got out into the community, how they coordinated people walking together for support, how they coordinated people carpooling together, how they coordinated people pulling their money together for Black-owned cabs to take them, was through organizations like the Montgomery Improvement Association, but also most importantly through women's organizations in the church. Why do you think that is? Why do you think through women's organizations, through the local churches, the African American Episcopal churches and the African American Baptist Church in Montgomery?
Probably because women are the organized leaders.
That's right, and they have the well-established networks of communication, right? So when you need to sit down and say, let's call people and figure out where we're going to walk, right? Let's call and see where we're going to protest and picket with signs. Let's call and see how we're going to coordinate cab riding or ride sharing. The women already have those phone trees, already have those numbers. Yes, Fred. You're muted.
Where are we going to go to the bathroom? It's true. You know, you think about when we take a trip, you know, we might stop still at a service station, or we might stop at a diner, but what do you do if you can't get into a diner, or you can't stop at a business because of your skin color? So that was a very big item.
Great.
We're going to go to the bathroom, and if we have little kids, what are we going to do with them?
Excellent point, Fred. Thank you very much. Yes. And so, right, again, it's at the very root level that you see this coordination going, that you see people working with each other to create this movement. And what they do is they coordinate, and they are successful. In more than a year, they damage the business of the Montgomery buses so badly that they are desegregated within a little bit over a year. And to the activists, this is like a godsend, because to them, this is like, nonviolent direct action can work. If we are coordinated, if we have a strategy, if we organize, if we work through the churches and social organizations like the Black Freemasons, the Black Elks Clubs, the League of Women Voters, the Women's Political Council, the NAACP, and Urban League, and we coordinate it under a clear umbrella with a clear agenda, we can be successful. And so after this success, the Montgomery Improvement Association morphs into what is called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, founded in '57. That is really one of the root organizations of the civil rights movement. Yes, and your name is again, I'm sorry?
Bobby.
Bobby, yes, again, thank you, Bobby.
Here we go. I had it, and then I didn't have it, and then I had it again. Are we seeing kind of when the people doing the boycott made sure that the people in power, money-wise, it hurt to segregate? And didn't that kind of show people that the people with the power and the money, it really was, they didn't really believe it, that it's an illusion, that the whole racism thing, I mean, that the whole white supremacist thing is an illusion, that it's all about power and keeping the money, not what they thought. I don't know, I'm not being very clear.
So to me, I think this is what I heard, and it was pretty clear to me that that although there is change happening, what is driving that change really is a financial incentive, right? And that's the frank reality, that at a certain level, particularly among northern industrialists and capitalists, like, you know, I'll use Five and Dime, or growing up we called them Woolworth. And that was one of the first, that was the beginning of the sit-in movement in Greensboro, North Carolina, when those students refused to give up their seat at Woolworth. And it was the national office that called down to that Woolworth in North Carolina and said, you need to end this, because it's not only impacting you as the local person that has Woolworth, but it's attacking the national brand. And so that was a very big incentive, although that incentive might not be as you know, as feel good as, you know, doing it because it's the right thing. Oftentimes, capitalism can be one of the best incentives, and in a capitalist society, that is something that was used successfully by the civil rights activists.
I have a question related to that.
Yes, Martin.
I mean, today, bus companies are public utilities, essentially. When the bus boycott took place in Montgomery, buses were operated by private companies. Uh, did that make it easier for pressure to be applied? I mean, if the city of Montgomery had owned the bus system, they might not have succumbed to the pressure because of the politics of the time.
Yeah, so I
But
would say, yeah, good question. And when I look at it, I think there's a couple things. One, I think you might have something there with private companies might have had more pressure from a national level, or more importantly, from just a bottom line level to desegregate. But I think the city buses would have as well, because African Americans were like over 50% of the ridership for the buses. So finance is a pretty big, incentive for them. But I also think a big piece of it as well was the media attention. And one of the things I think that having Dr. King, having Rosa Parks as symbols did was to create media attention that then showed people, it lifted the veil of silence and the veil of ignorance that many Northerners had, right? Many Northerners understood that it was bad in the South, but it wasn't until they really saw it broadcast over the televisions that they understood what sort of means people were willing to go through to keep another race segregated, to keep the status quo in the South. So I think that application of financial pressure, and then eventually in the second phase of, going down in protests, and then in particular things like Freedom Summer in 1964, the summer of '64, when those three workers, registering voters in Mississippi, Thomas Schwerner, Andrew Goodman, and Cheney were murdered down in Georgia. Those things really helped to fortify in the national mind and the national senses that something dramatically needed to change in the United States on race. Does that answer questions? Excellent. Any more comments or questions? Excellent. So the MIA, right? This is that thing that provided that leadership. Subsequently, you had the Southern Christian Leadership Conference that occurred. And throughout the second phase, right, you had nonviolent protests like boycotts, as I said, started in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960, then subsequently led to the development of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, younger people jumping on with the movement, sit-ins on counters throughout the country. And the high point of this phase, the high point of nonviolent direct action, is this March on Washington. And most of you are familiar with the March on Washington because of the speech of Dr. King, "I Have a Dream." And this is that very big point of nonviolent direct action. And after 63, actually after 63 and 64, the Civil Rights Act, and 65, the Voting Rights Act, there's a major shift towards militancy in the movement. And part of that is throughout 63, 64, and 65, what is building up is what historians call a revolution in rising expectations. And what that revolution in rising expectations means is every small court case that was won in legalism, every big triumph that happened during nonviolent direct action, young African Americans want things to change faster. So for example, if you happen to be Black in Newark, New Jersey in 1965, nothing has changed for you. Right? You can go to integrated schools, right? You can go to any white neighborhood if you want to, but you are still deeply impoverished, still struggling from segregated schools, from financial segregation. So 64 and 65 don't do much for you. And this is the group that becomes very agitated and inflamed and move more towards militancy. And that really begins to happen after after the March on Washington. Another fundamental thing that happens after this March on Washington. Yes, Bobby, excellent question. You got a question about it, excuse me.
I'm so sorry, but I just had could this be identical to what is happening after we had Obama, and then there was a feeling that many of us had about expectations in the country, And then suddenly we're seeing again on our televisions, on our phones, we're seeing this, and then we're moving into again just being furious.
So I was going to say that exact, almost like verbatim, right? Right. I was going to say, no, Barack Obama was the victim of rising revolution and rising expectations. I'm glad you caught that. Great way to see that connection, right? That yes, it's, and I don't think it's unique to anyone. I think it's unique. It's just our species, right? When you have someone that you believe in, you have these expectations believed in, and it falls a little flat. There is that angst, right? There is that anger that rises up, and I would argue that to some extent that is what we are witnessing in this modern era, right? As it relates to not only Black Lives Matter, as it relates to kind of the radical left and the radical right, right? There's these opposing forces, and a lot of what's in the center, which is the vast majority, is getting drowned out. And I think that's something that should be called out, and that is important to understand. That what makes, from my view, the civil rights movement successful, even in the phase when they were kicking out, white activists in the more militant phase, is that they were still willing to have debate. They were still willing to have conversations over whose ideas were better. And I'm seeing on the left and far right as well, actually I don't even criticize, but the right and the far left, right, that there are elements that want to shut down debate. And fundamentally, we've got to move to a paradigm where we elevate debate, we elevate ideas, because I believe that good ideas will always rise to the top. That's the nature of our system. That's the nature of liberalism, and not talking liberalism and leftism, but liberalism as in progress and liberty, right? It's about viewing, perfecting, and moving forward. And so I'm hoping that, through more education, we'll get to that process more in this modern era that is, and modern movements that are happening. Good question. So, an important piece of what happened in the I Have a Dream was this development of what is called colorblind racism in the late 60s throughout the 70s. And this is an important idea because, does anyone know what Dr. King argued for in his the big thing of his I Have a Dream speech? What is the big centerpiece of it?
To be colorblind.
Not really. That's the way people interpreted it, right? So what Dr. King said was to judge not by the color of the skin, but by the content of the character. And in the 70s, what ended up happening, we moved to this period called colorblind racism. And that was where we were told that you don't see color, that color doesn't exist. And this is articulated in a book by a man by the name of Edward Bonilla Silva, who is he's a sociologist, Puerto Rican, and he wrote a book called Racism Without Racists. And he starts this book with I Have a Dream. One of the things I remember growing up as a child was one of the PSAs that I grew up with as a child. And this PSA had a grandfather that was fishing with his grandson. And they were on a lake, and they were talking about one of their friends at school, and one of the young boy's friends at school. The boy was maybe 7, 8. And the grandfather said, so Johnny, who is Timmy? Who is he? And he said, Timmy is one of my Jewish friends. And his grandfather says, whoa, you are racist, Johnny, because you think of Timmy as your Jewish friend and not just your friend. And that is the message behind colorblind racism, right? And colorblindness, this idea that you take away the identity of the person because if you don't see color, then racism doesn't exist. When the reality is, even in a colorblind society, racism exists. But even then, being colorblind shouldn't matter. For me as a Black person, right? I am super light skinned. Both my mom are black. Both my mother and father are Black. Neither of them are white. My mother has white ancestry somewhere. My father has white ancestry that I know of, like 3 generations back. My great grandmother. And when I did a DNA test, I came out about 36% white, being mostly Irish, Scottish, and a little bit Norwegian. And I didn't realize that I was, had a mixed ancestry till I was about, I want to say maybe 11 or 12, junior high school. I was walking to school with one of my really good friends, these 2 twins, Angelo and Philip DeMeglio, these twins that lived down the street, Ange and Philippe. And they had two older twin brothers, Louis and Vinny, who were best friends with my brother. So like our families were really, really tight. They owned the pizza place in my neighborhood. And so we're walking to school, and he goes, you know, Todd, he goes, you're part white. And I go, no, I'm not. Dude, no. And then I went home and asked my parents, and my dad told me the story about my great-great-grandmother who married a black man in West Virginia. That's where my dad's ancestors are from, you know. So obviously, this white woman had to be pretty strong to marry a black man openly in you know, the late 19th century or middle 19th century in West Virginia. But that's, you know, even being light skinned, I see myself as black. That's who I am. I'm not African American. Older generations might call African, but me as a Gen Xer, I see myself as black. That's my identity as black. When I've always looked in the mirror, I've always seen black people. Blackness has always surrounded me, right? In my home with my uncles, my nephews, my nieces, my grandparents, my aunts. And so that's what that's what getting rid of color blindness is about. It's about seeing a person for who they are, but not judging them for what you see, right? And I think that was the width in the King message, right? That if you don't see color, then it'll go away, versus I see you, but I'm not going to judge you based on that. I'm going to judge you by this character that you have. And if you have the time to read Edward Bonilla Silva's book, it is not very long. It's a couple hundred pages. It's a really, really fast read. It's a great work on the scholarship of colorblindness and colorblind racism. Any comments or questions about that, about nonviolent direct action before we shift into third phase militancy, and then we do a little bit of kind of breaking out work? All right, so Black Power movement. So the Black Power movement, most of you probably are familiar with Malcolm X, right? It grows in the 1960s, it grows as a slogan, and this is called militancy, this third phase, where the movement fragments, where whites are kicked out of the movement to start their own, where it becomes more militant, where if you look at certain elements of the Black Power movement, particularly of the Black Panthers, they become Marxists, right? Or sorry, Maoists, right? Maoist, Leninists, right? Where they espouse violent overthrow. Then there's more kind of moderate elements of the Black Power movement, and more specifically of the Black Panthers. But this movement is about empowering Black youth, about bringing back community empowerment through Black community policing, Black firemen, Black businesses. It's all about social uplift, and the architect of this movement. And I will share this PowerPoint. The architect of Black Power is rooted in this man right here. His name is Robert F. Williams, and there's a book back here called Radio Free Dixie by Timothy B. Tyson, and Robert F. Williams also wrote the book Negro with Guns. That really was the foundational book for Huey P. Newton and the establishment of the Black Panthers. Robert F. Williams is a very important African American. He was a Marine. One of the first encounters he had with racism was living in Monroe County in coastal North Carolina. The sheriff in Monroe County was Jesse Helms Sr., Senior Jesse Helms. And one of the first incidents of his life he saw was Senior Jesse Helms beating a Black woman in the middle of the street. And he remarked about how powerful it was, and how this woman and no one and all the Black men around him did absolutely nothing. They were fearful, and how they let this Black woman be beat. And his family was militant. One of the presents his grandmother gave him was a gun. So he eventually joins the Marines. And in the Marines, he learns to be trained as a soldier. When he leaves the Marines, he comes back to Monroe and he joins the NAACP. And a couple big incidents really change his viewpoint. He really is a believer of nonviolent direct action until one case where these 3 African-American women are sexually assaulted by white men, and him and the NAACP tell them that he will work to get their case and have these men prosecuted. No prosecution comes out of it, no charges come out of it. Another case is an important case that he took up in Monroe and in the NAACP that propels him to the forefront of media attention. Is called the kissing case. It was a case where a 7, a 9, and an 11-year-old Black boy were being charged with felonies and looking at 15 to 20 years for playing kissing games with white girls that were about her age. And so this propels the NAACP to the forefront, and particularly Robert F. Williams to the forefront in that thing. And what he comes to realize is what needs to happen is blacks need what he promoted, this idea of armed self-reliance, that the Constitution gives African Americans the right to protect themselves and their property, and that if government and the police aren't going to protect themselves and property, then black communities have the right to do it themselves. Another aspect of his idea of armed self-reliance, why it's not just called armed self-defense, is that black communities need to rely on themselves. They need to rely on themselves through the churches, through black organizations, through black-owned businesses, support their businesses to funnel income through the internal neighborhoods. And then in '62, he published his book called Negro with Guns, that really becomes one of the basis for the Black Panthers and the Black Power movement. Eventually, he needs to leave the country. He's forced to leave the country because the FBI wants him. They put out a warrant for his arrest. They put out a warrant for his arrest because there is a race riot occurring in Monroe County, North Carolina. In the middle of this race riot, a white couple pulls down their street in the middle, in the black neighborhood. Him and his family go and help the white couple, bring them into the house. The FBI accused them of kidnapping. The white couple's like, no, they actually saved us. They didn't kidnap us. They put warrants out. And then Robert F. Williams and his wife, Mabel, go to Cuba, where they are accepted by Fidel Castro. They end up going to China, where they're accepted by Mao. And in Cuba, he runs his own radio out of radio station out of Cuba that he broadcasts to the United States called Radio Free Dixie. And that's what this book by Timothy Tyson is about, this radio where he plays black soul music, black funk, but also talks about the black civil rights movement and his ideas of armed self-reliance. Comments or questions about why would this move to black power or who Robert F. Williams was? Here goes a picture of Robert Williams and his wife, Mabel. So in 1966, the Black Panther Party, that is formed again, brought about.
We're not getting the picture.
Oh, okay.
We didn't get the last one either.
Let me see about sharing again. What? I'm busy.
Do you see it now, Marge? Okay,
I see it. I saw the first one.
okay.
Sorry, my
He
wife.
just doesn't like me.
Sorry, my wife had to ask me about my kid really quick. Sorry. Is anyone else having trouble with this?
I can see two people and they're both holding guns.
Yes, exactly. That's Rob Williams and his wife, Mabel.
Does anybody else not see it?
Mark, are you on a tablet?
Yes.
That might be the
That
reason.
might be it. Yeah, sorry. It might be the image that might be too big. Can you see this? Can you see this slide?
We can
No, I'm
see
not-
it on our mini.
Okay. Well, that's all right. Don't worry about me.
For sure. Okay, excellent. So the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense emerges as one of the most prominent organizations, and they get a lot of bad press. And I'm going to go through this just because there's like, I want to leave some open for questions like the last 15 minutes and really kind of get one last thing. But what I want to get at with the Black Panthers is dispelling a lot of.
I got it.
All right. I'm going to dispel a lot of the mythology about the Black Panthers. So a lot of mythologies that they were violent, they were anti-white, that they committed acts of violence. But actually, some of the programs innovated by the Black Panther Party are still in existence today. Free lunch in schools, free lunch after schools, that was the Black Panther Party that started those. And then Lyndon Johnson adopted that so that he could help to undermine the Black Panther Party. After school care, after school programs, besides feeding, those programs were also started by the Black Panthers. I was in Oakland about 7 years ago. I used to live in Northern California. I love Oakland. Now I was at one of my friend's house and I was walking around and I came across this sign that you see. And this is a plaque commemorating one of the things they did. And this is what the Black Panthers did that not many people know about. It says, after several children attending the nearby Santa Fe Elementary School were killed and many injured by motorists at this intersection, the demand for traffic signal by the Anti-Poverty Center and the Black Panther Party began in June 1967. However, the Oakland City Council notified the community that a traffic signal would be erected no sooner than late 1968. Rather than allowing another death in the interim, a small cadre of armed Black Panthers stopped motorists and personally escorted children across the busy intersection No further automobile-related deaths or injuries occurred at this location, and installations of traffic signal began in August 1st, 1967. So that's really kind of the very root of what this group was about, right? Empowering the community, seeing where there were gaps that were not being enforced or gaps that were missing, and then filling in those gaps is really what the root of the of that group was. So for the last like 10 minutes, and then we'll leave a little bit, I'm going to talk about these two things, and I want to do, we're going to do like a quick speed round. I want to put a question out once we get to it about de facto racism, but first I want to define these two for you. So de jure racism was that process that occurred, is racism by law. De facto racism is racism by practice. So even when de jure racism existed, de facto racism existed. But now in the United States, de jure racism no longer exists because of legalism, because of nonviolent direct action. The Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were passed. So now what we have is where we're living in this era of de facto racism or racism by practice. So we were going to do a speed round, which is, for, the next, minute or so, if everybody could say, one thing, what they think, with one example, what they would perceive as de facto racism or racism by practice.
Everybody, if you would unmute yourselves and just pop out your thoughts on de facto racism.
8 days ago,
I have,
8 days ago,
I,
the president wrote an executive order outlawing the teaching of theories about race or race training, sensitivity training, all that kind of stuff. That in theory will affect every single contractor that has federal funds, including universities.
1619 was.
Excellent, thank you. That is great because it's not a law, right? It all is executive order, but it impacts all the federal, all the federal.
I don't know how to get in.
Okay, anybody else?
I think
I don't know how to get in.
Go ahead,
No, I don't think so.
Bobby, go ahead.
No.
I think any statistics at all having to do with the our juries, our judicial system, our prisons, any data at all
Just
will
gonna get
show
one of this
clearly
audio.
de facto racism.
Awesome. Excellent.
Okay, thanks, Bobby. Janice?
Yes, the neighbor that came to our house a couple of weeks ago when we were getting ready for our yard sale and said, watch out for those Hispanics when they walk around and check out your house. They're going to make sure everything's locked up and safe.
Good example.
And yep, that's
George Caldwell.
Yes, 2 nights ago, our president, in front of 72 million people, gave support to racist organizations throughout the country. And it wasn't a dog whistle, it was a bullhorn.
Bullhorn, yes. Yep.
Okay, Marge.
I'm a deacon in an Episcopal church in Chester, Pennsylvania, which is a city that's 70% Black, in which the school system is abysmal, in which charter schools are flourishing and public schools are declining, and it's because the schools are underfunded, because the property taxes aren't high enough. The state support for the schools is not balancing out what the property taxes can't do. Business and industry left Chester after World War II pretty much, well, in the 50s there. They were mostly shipbuilding and tank building, I think. And then after the war, there were some Sun Oil and some other companies who were building ships in there. And then they all left, and there were no low-skilled labor jobs left. So there's terrible poverty. And the government, the city government, is so corrupt that when things that should be turning around don't get turned around because the money doesn't go where it really should go. And the entire thing just sort of keeps, getting worse. So I think that it is the result of centuries. I know it's the result of centuries of discrimination since the Civil War. Everything has been based on race in this area of Pennsylvania, and it's it's no longer de jure. It was at one point, but it remains de facto and very openly.
Thanks, Marge. Jan Crawford, do you have an example of de facto racism?
Well, I'm not sure if this applies or not, but the first thing that came to my mind was the lack of health care for African Americans that we hear all the time.
Okay, good example. Gaylin, Pack.
First thing that came to my mind was voter suppression and gerrymandering.
Okay, great example. Let's see, Neil Clark.
The only comment I have to make is that in the areas that I've lived in Oregon all my life, that the Hispanic people probably suffer more racism effect of that than the Black community does, because there's no blacks in the communities I've lived in. So, but you see Hispanics, Mexican, Latinos being disfranchised all the time.
Good example. Sally. Oh, sorry. Neil, sorry, I cut you off. I'm sorry. Sally?
Well, I've read books about racism in the South, and reading the books, I cannot believe. I thought that in the beginning I had to read again the dates, because the dates that I thought these horrible things that happened basically in the South to people, mainly by law, were now. It's now, and it's just not going away. So I don't know what else to do with that.
Thank you, Sally. Gail or Dawn, do you have comments? If you do, you can unmute yourselves.
The first thing that I thought of was our Title I schools here in Salem, Oregon, the Salem Kaiser school system that don't get funding that they really need. When there was a school in West Salem that got a huge parking lot and funding for other things that were not book related. So our students here, there's definitely racism.
That's a great example, Gail. Thank you. What about, let's see, Martin, did you have an example?
Well, I think you could look at any social and economic statistic for the United States, whether it's incarceration rates or life expectancy or employment or wealth, and you can see an unequal distribution of all the things that are good and the things that are bad. My statistics professor said that correlation is not causation, but when strong correlations are a cause to look further.
Very good example.
On the news, almost every night we see COVID and how it's just, and how the percentages with people of color.
Good point, Bobby.
Yes, for sure.
Ithar.
Hi. I wanted to say the first thing I think about being in a university setting is how hard it is to retain Black, Latino, and students of color. Also, who gets those internships? Who gets those university jobs? And so ultimately that affects their educational outcomes, really.
Excellent point. That's a great point. Caprice, do you have an example?
Well, I have an example, and I think a lot of these other examples are much bigger and broader and more important, but this is stuck in my brain and I need to share it. It's something that happened to me today. I was involved in some volunteer work, and the person that was running the volunteer work treated the only Black customer that came in differently than the other people, saying, making some disparaging remarks. And I was like so upset. I just didn't know what to do. And I mentioned it to her, or to the person that was in charge, and confronted her, the person. But there wasn't any, it was just a clear example to me of de facto racism.
I want to ask a question of you, Caprice. What do you think you would do?
Excuse me, I'm interrupting, but someone is sharing their email.
We got it, Bobby. We got it. We're on it. Thank you. Caprice, let me go back to you. Is there something different you would do next time, maybe? I think we've lost Caprice. She has internet issues. Bobby, thank you. Yes, it's Gail George. You've got a screen share up. And I just wanted to let you know that you probably hit your share screen accidentally, and you may not have seen my chat, which is okay. It's advertising our Thursday conversation. I just wanted to let you know.
Okay, I think we'll buzz off because we're lost in space here.
Okay, well, thank you for coming.
We're here.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, Taylor, let's go back to you.
Yeah, so, really, I just, if there's, are there any questions that anybody might have for me? I thought I was going to stop sharing. Yeah, so wait, here we go. I can do this. Perfect.
There you go.
Yeah, just wanted to just, thank you all for being very, for participating. And I hope that you got to see the complexities, and more importantly, I hope you can see how you can apply some of these maybe to your life, right? Particularly when it comes to organizing, when it comes to supporting people in your church, or more importantly, when it comes to talking to politicians and participating, that there aren't any simple answers. Right? This idea that we can reduce something to a sign and we can reduce something to one thing is not going to be it. It's going to take, a continued generational fight and then navigating those waves of rising expectations.
Taylor, that's absolutely correct. And I see now that we're back on a huge gallery view that I didn't hear from Wayne and Amy. If you would unmute yourself, you sent a great chat, and I wish you would articulate what your comment was.